There's no equality on any issue in class society. And so we always need, on every crisis, every struggle, to put on class glasses if we're going to understand what's going on through all the media hype. And I'm glad to speak after the reports on the demonstrations against police violence, racism, police killings right here in the U.S., and especially on Martin Luther King Day. Because racism is the biggest problem facing the working class in the struggle here in the U.S. It's also true in France. It's true in every imperialist country. And we've all seen here the continual media cover-up of police killings. Every 22 hours, police kill a black youth. There's no equality. Imagine having to assert Black Lives Matter. Because not only to the media, to the courts, in employment, in housing, in every single area, every message is, they don't matter. And it's taken a big, big struggle for tens of thousands, especially of young people, but tens of thousands of people in the streets, and again and again and again, we look at the past few months, risking arrest, to even begin to expose that fact, that one fact, that every 22 hours, another youth of color is killed. And yet even all of these demonstrations aren't enough to bring charges on one cop for the killing of a youth. So how do we put in perspective when the international media focuses on a massacre, as they say, of 12 journalists in Paris on January 7th at a satirical magazine, Charlie Hebdo, notorious for its racist and anti-Muslim caricatures. Now, just to look at the term massacre, that shows the bias too. There were 2,000 deaths in the Israeli assault on Gaza this past summer. 4 times as many deaths of civilians every day for 6 weeks as the deaths in Paris. There were 17 journalists killed in Gaza, civilians, in places that were supposedly safe for civilians. 8 media centers were targeted and bombed. And yet the capitalist media, the whole power structure, never ever, globally this was true, referred to these deaths as a massacre. So even a word can express an enormous bias. And we have to look at things that way also. When they say there's a demonstration 1 million strong for equality, fraternity, and the free press, and you see every ruler, every politician, not only in France, but throughout Europe, along with Israel, they're in the front lines, then we really have to look at what are the words that they're using. Now, free press, let's really take that on. In France, just this past summer, now here we're not even talking about the war in Algeria in the 1960s. This past summer, in France, any demonstration on Palestine was banned. And not just banned, not just no, you can't do it. A year in jail and 15,000 euros was a fine. And to post on social media any announcement about a demonstration was also punishable by a year in jail and 15,000 euro fine. Now, how's that for freedom of the press?
Yeah, thank you.
So, France was actually the only country in the world to bar all demonstrations on Gaza. Now, but this demonstration, this huge demonstration, it does show that the killings at the Charlie Hebdo magazine and also at the supermarket, strengthens the hand of the state. It really gives them one more way to assault the working class movement and to get the working class behind them in an attack, particularly on the Muslim community in France, and to justify their wars. They said this huge demonstration was a demonstration of solidarity against terrorism. Now, who is responsible for terrorism on a monstrous scale internationally? The U.S. and the French and the British, the old colonial powers, and the U.S., the center of imperialism, has carried out absolute terror. What on earth is a daisy cutter and a drone and napalm and white phosphorus and secret rendition and secret torture centers? This is really terrorism on a huge scale. So when you have a big demonstration calling for solidarity against terrorism, they really mean they want solidarity for a new imperialist war. And it's very dangerous because they're trying to galvanize and whip behind. The wars in France are really unpopular. French participation in Iraq, in Libya, Afghanistan, overwhelmingly, and now in Syria, the population in the great majority is against these wars. And they're trying to turn that around. And that's what this huge demonstration was really about. Let's all get behind the French ruling class in a war on terrorism. They are the terrorists, and that's where terminology and words are so important. Now, it's a crucial role of the media in shaping whose lives matter, whose lives are really important. Now, there was also an important demonstration, 2 of them, we should look at here in New York City. There were 2 cops shot sitting in their patrol car December 20th. It actually had nothing to do with the big upsurge against police killings, but it was seized hold of by the cops to push the mayor back, to push the movement back, to call for an end to any demonstrations. And then there were these two public funerals. JetBlue flew in free any cop from anywhere in the country who wanted to come in for these demonstrations, for these funerals. There were demonstrations. They were demonstrations. And they were demonstrations, whole parts of the city. Streets were closed off. They set up huge jumbotrons, jumbo screens to show the funeral. To show cops turning their back on de Blasio. Because that's a political statement too. They're trying to push back and say that they're the law. So demonstrations are important for us, for the ruling class too. Now, back to there's no equality anywhere, nothing is equal in class society. Let's look a little bit more at free speech. The French government has actually protected the racist journal, Charlie Hebdo, for years. And it has nothing to do with protecting freedom of speech. And so confronting freedom of speech itself, that's important. Confronting the very concept that the press here or in France or in any of these imperialist countries is free. We got to take that on. Because it pulls in a lot of people, including within the political movement. Now, the same government that protected Charlie Hebdo magazine banned any demonstration protesting Charlie Hebdo magazine. That's important to know. Even public prayers, or in the street prayers, opposing the magazine, were banned. Now, it's not that there's no vehicle. There are actually laws on the books in France that say there'll be prosecution for public insults based on religion, on race, on ethnicity, on national origin. But the really racist, sexist, gross, bigoted cartoons in Charlie Hebdo were never successfully or legally prosecuted. But anyone protesting against them, that's a charge. So insults to Muslims or the Prophet Muhammad, that's to be allowed. Protests against it, that's banned. That's equality in capitalist terms. That's the way equality works for them. At the time when the ban was the strictest was in 2012 when really protests swept the Muslim world in response to an anti-Muslim film made right here in the U.S. And that was also at the time where people burst into the U.S. embassy in Libya and killed the U.S. ambassador to Libya. In France, the interior minister said that every division, every department in France was under strict orders and complete crackdown, total ban. Demonstrations will be banned and broken up along with public prayer meetings. That same week, this magazine put out an extra run of cartoons featuring a really grossly obscene caricature of the naked Prophet Muhammad. And it was given extra police protection. So this is a double standard when they just saturate the media with free press. There's this, as I say, there's this French law in the books saying that no public insult based on religion or race or ethnicity or national origin, and yet there have been all these right-wing and racist and anti-immigrant demonstrations all over France, and have any of them been banned? See, it's only some demonstrations that have been banned, but not the right-wing and anti-immigrant demonstrations in France. They have not been banned. Now, the press in France, as I say, anywhere in the imperialist world, certainly here in the U.S., it's not free, it's not open, it's not accessible. The media is owned and it serves the interests of the ruling class. And what can be said is very tightly controlled. The corporate media in capitalist society is owned to serve class rule, and what's covered depends entirely on who can pay. And there are a handful of multi-billionaire media conglomerates that control almost all, not only information, but culture and entertainment in the Western capitalist countries. Now, in the past decade, it's really true that social media and the internet have opened a few cracks in this overwhelming corporate control. But ideas, as John said in his talk, the ideas in class society are shaped from above. And so constantly resisting them, that's an important part of what revolutionaries need to be doing all the time. And the media shapes whose lives matter, what deaths go reported, what go unreported, or consciously covered up. Now, consider the hundreds of thousands of deaths by U.S. imperialism, and French and British, that are unmarked, that are labeled collateral damage in the wars in Iraq. The figure, I think we can all remember, Madeleine Albright, saying the death of 500,000 children in Iraq was worth it. Was worth it. You would think that that would have the media, I mean, after all, she said it on to 60 Minutes, I think it was. At any rate, the toll of deaths in every one of these countries is really unmarked. Iraq, Syria, Libya, Afghanistan. There's no mass sympathy. And there's no mass sympathy if a U.S. drone hits a wedding party in Pakistan, or a whole village with a Hellfire missile. Maybe it'll get 2 lines of press. Even if there are huge demonstrations in Pakistan and they shut down the Khyber Pass for 4 months, which they did, you wouldn't know it here. You wouldn't know it. Now, let me just ask, how many people here can remember Chelsea Manning and the release of the videos of U.S. helicopters gunning down 2 Reuters camera operators? Seen that video? Many people have. And then this helicopter gunship came around again. A van, a family stopped to help these 2 journalists lying there on the ground. And they came back and shot the entire family. The father, the mother, the kids, little infant. You can hear the cameraman talking. I mean the helicopter gunship pilots talking. Oh, we really wasted them. Chelsea Manning is in prison today for revealing videos like that. So it's not that the U.S. doesn't know, or even that a lot of people here don't know, but it's always ripped out of context. It's important to also take note of the U.S. bombers that targeted RTS, Radio TV Serbia. I was in Yugoslavia just after the bombing of this building, completely destroyed, 17 journalists killed, publicly done, no denial, openly targeted. They did the same thing in Libya, destroyed the media center, killed the journalists inside. Lucy Paguado told us last week, the most dangerous country in the world, Honduras, 46 journalists and media workers since the U.S.-backed coup in Honduras. No sympathy for them. We don't hear of these as being massacres. And we could also look at when those who expose, also like Edward Snowden or Julian Assange, when they show the scale of U.S. connivance, what happens to them? They're literally on the run. Now, we could look also, there's major media stations from Iran, from Lebanon, Press TV, Al-Manar. They're barred from satellites from even broadcasting to the U.S. That's freedom of press. They're barred from broadcasting anywhere in Europe. That's freedom of press. You can catch it on the internet. Can't watch it on your TV. Apple and Google actually removed Al-Manar's mobile apps in order to shut it down. So nothing is equal in capitalist society, and we want to always remind the workers here of that on every issue. And in every struggle, they want to see how they can turn an issue to their advance. Now, humor and satire, we should, and I'm going to sort of end on this, it's an issue where there never can be equality. And it's something revolutionaries should always remember, between the oppressor and oppressed. Now, satire, it actually had a very rich tradition in French history, going back to Voltaire. The whole idea of satirizing the king, the nobility, the super rich, the gloated fat, who could act at will. And there seemed to be no weapon against them. So ridicule was used against the powerful, poking fun. It was used against the church and the nobility. But when the privileged mock and humiliate the oppressed, then it becomes a right-wing and a fascist weapon. It's totally different. And it's important to know, because there have been big struggles here in the United States to not allow racist symbols and cartoons and caricatures and movies and sports teams. And that struggle is still going on as to what sports teams are named and the symbols and caricatures that are used at halftime. It's not just all good fun. And refusing to allow these caricatures, that's an important part of the class struggle here and around the world. Now, That's where Charlie Hebdo plays an important role, because unless racism happens on so many subtle levels, then how do the French hide their wars abroad and make it acceptable? So I want to talk about, and you'll see again and again this magazine is described as left-wing because it was irreverent and nonconformist. It was very relevant. But it's a lot like, and it functions in the same way that a certain German publication, Der Stürmer, functioned in the rise of Nazi power in Germany in the 1930s. Now, Der Stürmer was a vehemently anti-Semitic publication. Now, they had cartoons against the Pope, against business people, against the wealthy sometimes. But overwhelmingly, very much like Charlie Hebdo, they depicted with exaggerated facial features and misshapen bodies and obscene, sexually explicit caricatures. Charlie Hebdo with Muslims and Der Stürmer with Jewish people in the 1930s. And it's what created the climate, hardened the population to find this acceptable. Played a very important role and it really helped to set the climate to make Jewish people an object of hatred, of fear, of ridicule, of disdain. At the end of World War II, the Allies put the editor of Der Stürmer, Julius Strechter, on trial. He didn't run a death camp, he didn't hold a gun, but he used the press to incite hatred. They put him on trial, convicted him of crimes against humanity, and he was executed. We should remember that. What did the French government do to Charlie Hebdo magazine? They gave them $1 million euro, boom, right after this shooting of the journalists. And Google donated 250,000 euro, and so on. So it's not freedom of expression and freedom of the press. It's really an instrument of war mobilization. The same magazine ran cartoons demonizing the Serbs during the NATO campaign on Yugoslavia, supported NATO's war on Libya, horrible caricatures of Gaddafi. National oppression and racism. It's stronger, more systemic, deeply rooted here in the U.S. than anywhere in the world. This country was built on slavery, on genocide. But every imperialist country, it was part of colonialism. It was part of conquering Africa and Asia, Latin America. And there are today in France 5.5 million people of African origin. Now, that's only 12% of the population, but it's 60 to 70% of the prison population. The Muslim population is overwhelmingly isolated by poverty. As Larry was explaining, whole suburbs ring, what are called suburbs, big public housing projects that are absolutely deteriorated, dark, nothing's working, elevators don't work, lights don't work. Some of them burned out shells, high unemployment, inferior schools. That's what exists in France today. So it's reflected in the prisons. Now just to say, the French prisons, it's about proportionately, U.S. prisons are 10 times as many people, 8 to 10 times as many people proportionately in prison in the U.S. But this is a targeting of whole peoples. And it's always the ruling class taking advantage with how to reinforce a repressive state apparatus and do everything that they can to reinforce that apparatus. And they also use, and they're really imperialist tools, some of the same impoverished people as their mercenaries in Syria and in Libya and in Iraq. And that anger that funding by the French and the U.S. and Turkey and Israel and Saudi Arabia to try to pull down the government of Syria was what was used to overturn the government in Libya. So it's both imprisonment, but it's also signing up in imperialist war campaigns. There are more than 1,000 French citizens of African, North African and Arab origin who have been sent as mercenaries into Syria. And at the time it was said, this will come back to France. That anger, that alienation, that rage, that frustration of being used will come back. So France today is involved in wars. They're the junior partner of the U.S. in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya, in Afghanistan. But they're also involved in their own wars in Mali and in the Central African Republic and in Chad, in the Ivory Coast, French troops in Djibouti, and really all over, particularly West Africa. They play a role with AFRICOM, NATO. All of this has an impact, and it comes back. So this was an effort to divert attention, and our response, and it is why it's a material force, solidarity and resistance to racism, to bigotry, and to war mobilization. That really is a revolutionary contribution. Thank you. There are struggles here that have, I'll pick up on this point John was making, that have actually changed the working class struggle here, the consciousness, and also won important concessions from the ruling class. Now, the very concept of being one nation, one people, it took, you could look back 50 years ago, supposedly everyone could vote, but of course that wasn't true at all. It wasn't true at all. It took a huge struggle. It's very important, this film Selma coming out now, because it shows what kind of a struggle it is, and they really show these absolute thugs, these, I mean, really, and the way in which it was presented. But it was a struggle from below, and people who risked their lives, who defined a new reality. Now, in France, the idea of still being one nation, everybody's a French citizen. There is no affirmative action programs for the millions of, particularly Algerian, North African. They're not counted. They're not measured. That's why even, is it 60%, is it 70% who fill the prisons? It's like a speculative guess, because they're not counted in the same way as the same thing is true in the census. It was actually a struggle here to count black and Latino people in the census, and then say that funds and programs and whatnot had to be allocated on that basis, and even voting districts and so on. That was a struggle, really explosive, coming from below. Because it didn't happen in France, it means that even working class parties are pretty backward on recognizing what might be much more obvious from here about racism and national oppression. And along with all the other things that have happened since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the weakening, even back further, Eurocommunism as an idea, particularly in France, of trying to accommodate themselves to the ideas of the ruling class. So it's always like resisting those ideas consciously. Otherwise, you're pulled in tow. Now, just another thing on Charlie Hebdo, sometimes things are repeated endlessly. Supposedly, they claim again and again and again this is a left publication. That would be hard to imagine, because they've supported every imperialist war. I mean, on what do you count? a left publication, but they're irreverent, and they've poked fun and made humor and so on like that. So that doesn't count as leftism. It does not count as leftism, but characterizing them that way. And also they had a different history, what they were in the 1970s, and then they went defunct for a while and recreated and have gone through different hands. In 2009, one of their top people was actually fired for, I forget if it was an article or a caricature, that was anti-Semitic. See, that wasn't allowed. And it's because there's a change that's taken place. Israel couldn't live a minute without imperialist aid, especially from the U.S., every single minute, every day. And that has changed. Israel is, in the Middle East, and against the Arab world, their unsinkable aircraft carrier. And it's changed the standing also of Jewish people and the consciousness, unfortunately, in many, many ways. And we have to consciously struggle against that. Today, who's demonized? It's not Jewish people, not in the same way. And so we have to be aware of that the role of anti-Muslim demonization and bigotry and charges and who fills the prisons here, or after 9/11, where there were thousands of Muslim people arrested and just right away thrown into prisons and into solitary confinement and horrible sentences. So you never want to equate, because anti-Semitism still does exist in France. That's a fact. It exists in the U.S. It's a reality. Every form of both national oppression and backwardness and religious bigotry still exists festering underneath. And the ruling class uses it sometimes here and sometimes there. They play it like an instrument. And so at this point, what is really played in the U.S. and in Europe is horrendous bigotry and discrimination against Muslim, and particularly in France, against North African people. And yet it's uncounted. It's not measured. So, and that makes a certain backwardness even within the left, which hopefully should be and will be challenged. Now, I wanted to pick up on two other things just that were said in the discussion. Supposedly Anonymous made an announcement about they're going to now attack Muslim publications. We have no idea what Anonymous says or didn't say for the very fact that they're anonymous. So the media is always in a position to use them to attach to anything they want to show support in a reactionary way. Who said that? That's like anonymous. So we shouldn't accept that that is true at all. We should, within the movement, be trying to pull in more and more of the movement to stand up on this issue. Now, I'll be sending it around tomorrow. UNAC, the United National Anti-War Coalition, just put out an important, strong statement saying we are not Charlie Hebdo. We helped on that, I want to say, and really getting and helping in where we are in coalitions explain this issue and come out strong and fighting is what we're best at. We raise the politics here, but then we got to take it much wider, much wider. I think those were the main points really to raise, and really this is, I'll just end on this. This is following, I'm glad to mention, this is really following in the Leninist tradition, and in knowing that there are lots of folks who may say that they're socialists, but have ended up aligned with imperialism in their wars and in their racist attacks, and in with nationalism in the worst way. So we want to really, if you're going to be intransigent against the ruling class here, it means standing up to racism and standing up to their imperialist wars.